Thanksgiving. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Well, it's time for us to begin. We're in our last class tonight where we're going to be continuing our study of the book of Esther tonight. We're going to look at the last 5 chapters of the book of Esther tonight, Lord willing. Over our last period of study in the book of Esther, we've kind of led up to this point. We had looked at where Haman, who really is the antagonist in this story, had devised a plan where he basically manipulated King Xerxes and was going to seek the downfall of the Jewish people, but most notably his archenemy Mordecai. Mordecai and Esther discover the plot. Esther in chapter 5 really begins to put in motion the plan where she could reveal this to the king. And Haman's hatred and animosity grows entrenched, so much so that he places a stake or a tree on which he plans to impale Mordecai in the near future. And so that brings us really in some ways to chapter 6. Esther chapter 6 is really a hinge point. It is a book where there's extreme reversals. It's really a turning point in this narrative of God's story. It's where the events that seem to be going down one road, where it leads to the destruction of God's people, actually makes a reversal, and instead of being destroyed, they are honored, they are protected, and they are safeguarded. It's a chapter of reversals. It's a pivotal chapter. And as we kind of introduce that idea and think about that, when you see that type of reversal, you see that type of turning, that type of hinge, you have to ask the question, well, where's God must be in the picture? Because through just the manipulation of man, it doesn't seem that's going to be possible, that Haman seems to be on a roll. He seems to be headed to a direction. But we have really in the opening verses of chapter 6 indications that God intervenes. Someone described it kind of this way, and I think it's a good quote for us to kind of introduce chapter 6 with. He says, "Here is a remarkable instance of the veiled providential control over God, over circumstances of human history. Upon the king's insomnia, humanly speaking, were hinged the survival of the chosen nation, the fulfillment of prophecy, the coming of the Redeemer, and therefore the whole work of redemption. Yet the outcome was never in doubt. For God was in control, making the most trivial events work together for Haman's defeat and Israel's preservation." And in the first 5 verses of chapter 6, we see instances that pile upon one another to bring about this changing or turning of events. And it begins with this seemingly insignificant detail that the king was unable to sleep. I mean, if chapter 6 is a pivotal chapter, probably the pivotal phrase in that chapter is that one phrase, that King Xerxes or Ahasuerus was unable to fall asleep. He had insomnia. And we see some significance here even in this text. When you notice in verse 1, it says, during that night. There's some significance to this night. It's almost in parallel to that day back in chapter 5 and verse 9 when Haman went out to plot the downfall of Mordecai and the people. But we see God at work here, even in the king's insomnia. It goes on, it's not only that he's unable to sleep, it's his choice of entertainment. I mean, all of the things at his disposal, yet he chose to call his servants and have read to him this book of remembrances or recollections. That's what he chose to be entertained with. That's the story that he wished to lull himself to sleep, to hear of his own exploits, to make himself feel good. Now, I will tell you something about that book of remembrances. You'll see that in verse 1. It's, some say, book of records. The Chronicles, literally, it's book of remembrances, is while he's recalling all the things that he has done. God also, according to Malachi chapter 3 and verse 6, has a book of remembrances. In his book of remembrances are recorded those who do his will. So even as King Ahasuerus is recalling these events, God is also calling to his mind, figuratively, what he needs to do to protect his people. But it's not only that where God's providence is seen. So the king doesn't fall asleep. He chooses to have read to him the book of the Chronicles. The servants choose to read the very place that records the attempted coup by these two eunuchs of the king's court. If you'll notice, really, as we jump down to verse 2, it was found written what Mordecai had reported concerning Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who were doorkeepers, that they sought to lay hold of King Ahasuerus. And so it brought to mind the fact that he had not rewarded Mordecai. Now, whether that was just simply due to his forgetfulness, his oversight, for some reason, despite the fact that Mordecai saved his life, the king never chose to reward him. And I won't tell you that's somewhat of a unique feature of the Persian kings. They very much were willing to go out of their way to make sure loyalty and acts of service were rewarded, but yet Mordecai had not been. And by reading this, it was brought to his attention. And then, it just so happens, no, it didn't just so happen. Haman was the one who was in the court that the call went forth. If you'll notice and pick up the reading, he says in verse 4, so the king said, who's in the court? Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace in order to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows which he had prepared for him. So Haman come to the court thinking, I want to seek the king's permission. He's going to allow me to hang my archenemy. He has given me his signet ring. I'm the prime minister for all accounts. And he is going there to these grand plans, and just so happens the king calls him into his presence. And here's the question he asks him. He says down in verse 6, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, what is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor? And you know what Haman was thinking? He must mean me. And so he answered accordingly. He talks about giving him a robe that he wore and put him on one of the king's horses and allow the horse to be crowned, basically, and be led through the streets, acknowledging the honor being given to this individual. And so Mordecai answers. And what happens? The king answers him. He says, verse 10, then the king said to Haman, take quickly the robes and the horse just as you said, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have said. So Haman was forced to take the robe and set Mordecai on the horse and lead him through the city of Susa. Could you imagine a greater blow to the ego of this man? I mean, your enemy, the one you were plotting your downfall, you're the one who is now an instrument of the king, giving him great honor. And right away, we're kind of struck in this chapter, the fact of how God is able to take adversity and turn it into advantage. That's what happens here. Mordecai, who was not recognized, he hadn't been rewarded. The fact is, he was in the crosshairs of Haman, one of the second highest official in the land, and yet now he is being led through the streets of the capital city of Susa with honor by his enemy. God turned this to his advantage. And what does Haman do? Haman does the deed, then covers his head and goes to his house in mourning. And I want us to notice just quickly here at the end, look at verse 12 through 14 quickly. It says, Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried home mourning with his head covered. And Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. I want you to look at this and see what Zeresh and his friends and these wise men advise him. Do you remember all the way back when Mordecai failed to or chose not to bow before Haman? He grew incensed, and then he found out the nationality of Mordecai. And because he was a Jew, that's what started him down this path, as we talked about, as Haman was a descendant of the Amalekites, and the Jews, that long-standing animosity. But when they first hatched this plan, look over, if you will, in chapter 5, just a second. Notice in chapter 5 when he began to hatch this plan. Then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, Have a tree, most translations say gallows, 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the banquet. And the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. Now look at verse 14 and compare it to verse 13 of chapter 6. What's different in that text? I mean, the advice is different, obviously. But who amongst the group is different? What name's at it, huh? I mean, we still have Zeresh, his wife. We still have his friends. But who gives him the counsel in verse 15 of chapter 6?
The wise man and his wife.
Yeah, the wise men and his wife. And I kind of wonder as we look at that, just those two comparisons. At the time, Haman was so incensed and full of pride and anger, he wasn't willing to listen to wisdom. And I wonder if he didn't even invite these friends along because they seemed to go along with it. But now that he was mourning and humbled, wise counsel was given, but it was too late for him to heed. And notice what the counsel was, even of his wife. If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, you will not overcome him. The fact of the matter is even in the Persian court and the people of the city of Susa, they realize the protection of Jehovah. They understand the special place, it seems to me, that God had for his people because they recognize that if he was a Jew, he would not be overcome. And the only way I can draw a conclusion from that, because at this time they weren't particularly in the king's graces, Esther hadn't really made herself known. It's just the fact that they had to recognize that how their history, have some knowledge of their history, and these people had been spared. And so they lay this out before us. I'll tell you, looking at Haman in this text, you can't help but think about just a series of verses through Proverbs. I can't. I mean, how turning away from wisdom or listening to the wisdom, how you counter those who are wise or foolish. And I believe that's what we see in Haman. And I think it's a warning to us. Have you ever heard of putting blinders on or getting tunnel vision? I mean, we sometimes do that. When Haman first talked about this in chapter 5, all he could think about was the downfall of Mordecai. The embarrassed, and he wasn't willing to listen to any wisdom or any counter argument. And I tell you, we can get that way too. But in chapter 6, even though it was too late for him to heed, he heard this counsel from these wise advisors and his wife that they would not be able to stand if Mordecai was a Jew. So that's the turning spot, from rags to riches. So what do you all see? What would you all like to bring up in chapter 6? Ms. Bard?
Well, you talked about the turning point in there in 6:1. That night the king could not sleep. And I think about Esther and how, first of all, she called for a fast. 3 days. She had time to make a plan. And she didn't tell him at the first banquet. But I wonder if she maybe thought that he might invite her to spend the night. She hadn't seen him for 30 days. If that may have been part of her plan, but whether he did or not, we're not told. But it does say the king did not sleep.
No.
She was keeping him in suspense. And I think, that was her plan. And she was going to let him know the next day. Now, she didn't know that he was going to read from these chronicles. But I just find it interesting that she made this plan. She was very patient, very wise in her words, everything. And that made him much more so that he was going to do whatever she asked.
And we even see that continue in chapter 7 when she chooses her words wisely. I think in some ways for Esther, the turning point for Esther is really chapter 7. Chapter 7 is when she puts her life on the line and lays it all out there, not knowing the outcome or the response of the king. But I think it's a good point just to recognize the call for the fast and the accompanying prayers that accompany, and is this an answer to those prayers and the intervention of God there as well? Good point. Norman?
The play also allowed Haman to build up his pride a little bit more too.
Yeah. Well, that was most assuredly even built by the first banquet, right? Where she doesn't name the enemy, but he feels like he is chosen and unique and is he and only the king are the only ones invited to the banquet. He feels he has a special place. Matt and Boyd.
What's really interesting in verse 6, we have a tendency to read right past it. It says, and Haman said to himself. So how do we know what he said to himself?
Except God reveals it.
This is a clue to God being behind the scenes here, because this reveals that this is inspired. Whomever it is who wrote this, someone suggested Mordecai, but how would he know what Haman said to himself, except for the fact that he was inspired, which again is evidence of God's presence.
Amen. It's a good point. Good point. Boyd? Amen. Okay. Bob, did you have your hand up? I didn't see. I thought you did. Sorry.
I'd like to say this as well. From chapter 6 on, she refers to herself to the Jews as my people. So she has some.
Yeah. But before chapter 6, not, but after chapter 6, very much so. And most notably, when we start chapter 7, that identification is very clear to the king. That's a good point. So let's jump ahead to chapter 7. So chapter 7 is really the continuation of the plea that Esther is going to make and then the invitation to the banquet. Before we get into the text, I just want you to notice a couple of things. three different times in chapter 7 that we see the king drinking wine or Haman drinking wine. And most notably, I would point to verse 7. Even though the king was angry because of Haman's manipulation, it said his anger was from drinking. So as we kind of mentioned before, the role of banqueting and drinking throughout this book is significant, and how it seems to rob at least Ahasuerus of his right mind or logical thought. So here they come to the banquet, and it says in verse 1 that now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen, and then it was on the second day that the king made a request to Esther and just said, "What can I give you?" And again, he repeats that refrain, even up to half the kingdom. And I think we begin to see in the first 6 verses of chapter 7 some of the wisdom of Esther. But not only the wisdom, I think we see in chapter 7 the courage of Esther. As I talked about chapter 6 being a turning point, I think this is her defining moment of faith. She is going to petition the king. And even though she does so skillfully, there is always the possibility of rejection. And with rejection, there becomes the possibility of execution or at least banishment. And so she's willing to place herself on the line to make this request on behalf of herself and the people with whom she identifies herself with, as Bob pointed out. But I want us to notice how skillfully she kind of goes through this. She doesn't first come right out and says, "Yep, Haman's the bad guy," right? She starts off by really inviting the king to participate in this conversation. In verse 3, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me as my petition, and my people as a request." Do you see it kind of, he invites the king as in part of this, and he says, if you have any regard for me or my people, let this be my petition. And he continues on, and she continues on in the text and talks about what has happened in verse 4. It says, "For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, to be annihilated." So she puts it in pretty stark terms. He says we've been sold. You remember back to the 10,000 talents of silver that Haman had offered to the king, but it wasn't enslavement or even banishment that we were talking about there. Looking at the 3 terms there, he was talking about the destruction of God's people that remained in Persia. Destroyed, and to be killed, and to be annihilated. And then she even puts her request even more logically. She said, "King, I wouldn't have troubled you with this if it was just being sold off or being put in servitude, but it's the only reason I'm troubling with you with this is because our life is at threat." Notice the end of verse 4. "Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have remained silent, for the trouble would not be commensurate with the annoyance of the king." Again, she's skillful in her conversation. I guess I'll just throw a note in there. The end of chapter 4, apparently, verse 4, is there's some disagreement over how that ought to be translated. The most common translation is just what I read. Other translations, "The compensation of our adversaries' offers cannot be compared to the loss the king would suffer." And that's usually found in the NIV, but it's the same thought, really, to some degree. She's appealing to the logic of the king, and even in her request, she says, "I'm still considerate of you and what this might entail for you." And so she makes this request, and finally King Ahasuerus says, "Who is this? Who is the villain?" And she points to Haman. "A foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman." Then Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. She names the enemy. Now, the rest of chapter 7 kind of begins with the scene. The king arises, goes to the garden, and Haman falls at the feet of Queen Esther. Now, to kind of understand this story, most nobility, even at this time, reclined on couches when eating. So laying at her feet kind of creates a certain picture. when you think about her reclining and he kind of leaning over her. Because when the king comes in, he makes the assumption that Haman's tried to assault his queen. He grows even angrier. He says in verse 8, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. So as soon as he saw Haman bowing over the queen's feet, the word going out of his mouth is a figure of speech just saying he passed sentence. And they covered Haman's face. And what ends up happening? They go, and the implement of destruction for Mordecai was used on Haman himself. The greatest reversal, right? The punishment the wickedness that Haman was going to impose upon Mordecai was imposed upon him. And I'm going to tell you, that's often what God does when those who oppose his people. Look over in Psalm 7 real quick. Psalm 7, the psalmist talks about this very thing, how the Lord turns the tables on those who would oppose his people. Psalm 7, beginning in verse 14. Behold, he travails with wickedness. He conceives mischief and brings forth falsehood. He has dug a pit and hollowed it out, and he's fallen into the hole which he made. His mischief will return upon his own head, and his violence will descend upon his own plate or pate. So the fact of the matter is God turned the tables. And so Esther and her people and Mordecai were saved, and Haman himself was impaled upon the tree which he had prepared for Mordecai. But before I get your comments, I want to ask this question. Just from chapter 7, what do you make of these people? What stands out about their character or their personality here? What stands out in chapter 7, say about King Ahasuerus or Haman or even Esther in this text? Because there's enough details in chapter 7, I think it gives us a picture, really, of somewhat of their character. I mean, look at Haman here. I mean, so strong and prideful and arrogant, but as soon as the tide turns, he becomes so weak of heart. And I'll tell you, that is commiserate with someone who is impressed with themselves or have a bullying attitude. Really, they have a sense of insecurity, and you almost see that in Haman. You see Ahasuerus, who grows angry because of wine and largely is weak, but just simply reacts to situations. He doesn't have great forethought or wisdom. He doesn't see through the machinations of Haman or anybody else. And here we see Esther. Courage, skillful, wise with her words, eloquent, all here in this text. We get these insights into the character that we've been looking at. So, any thoughts through chapter 7 that anybody wants to bring up? Matt?
There's a couple of strange things that we have to try to figure out. Was the fact that the king was upset only because Esther is a Jew and he's not learning her for the first time? And that's the only thing that makes him unhappy about the fact that all the Jews are soon to be slaughtered? And I mentioned to you a few weeks ago, I found one commentator who has done a very, very deep dive on Esther, who suggests that in the old Persian language, the word destroy and the word enslave sound the same. And this commentator has suggested that when Haman first made the request, he purposefully made a play on the words so that the king thought he meant enslave, but in the edict that was written, he was able to slip in the word destroy. And we know, going forward, once an edict is issued, it cannot be undone. And so that would make a lot of sense of verse in 7:3 here. If it please the king, let my life be granted for me, my wish might be for my request. For if we had been sold out of my people to be destroyed, be killed, be annihilated, if we had been sold merely as slaves, she's talking about almost what this commentator seems to suggest. If it were true that we were only to be put into servitude, I wouldn't say anything. But we have, and the edict says that we are to be destroyed. And it seems that why would a king slaughter millions of people in his empire for whom he could tax? It just seems a little over the top for him to do that, unless, and it's only a potential thinking, Haman and the villain in Haman was getting the king to issue an edict not knowing full well what it was. And Esther may be conveying that play on words here by saying if it was only being enslaved, I wouldn't have said anything, but the edict is to destroy. And so we have to judge whether or not his only reason for being so upset now is because he only learns that Esther is a Jew now, or if in fact he realizes he's been duped.
The thing is I'll lean toward the former. It's mainly because it was made by Queen Esther. King Ahasuerus doesn't seem, at least, I hope everybody heard Matt's comments, but King Ahasuerus doesn't seem to be very humanitarian-minded, even of his own citizenry. When we go around and start killing the enemies, he grants Esther a second day to even go back through the city to make a more thorough job. So he doesn't seem to be overly concerned about all his subjects, is the way I would say it even in the text. Because we have a massacre of 575,000. Esther requests another day, and she kills another number of men are killed in the city. And he doesn't seem to blink at that either.
It seems to be despicable no matter what the
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's a good thought to think. Anybody else? Okay, so chapter 8. Oh, Brandon, sorry.
Yeah, quickly. I know we have about an hour to cover tonight, but these scriptures are so rich. We can learn so much about this as you bring this out. I think it's very clear that for whatever reason, she's finally coming into herself. She understands why she's there. Whether the Lord opened up her understanding, He used eloquence, intelligence, and manipulate to bring forth. It's very methodical. And I don't think that's accidental. You know, the older I get, the more I've said it before, the older I get, the more I see there are very few, I believe, coincidences and accidents. I do believe there's happenstance. I do believe that. But you know, I believe that the Lord works through us a lot in the same way. The question is for us, are we going to be Esther? Are we going to be a fitness when He puts us in situations? I'm not talking about saving a whole nationality, something that's broad and great and huge as that. I'm talking about everyday occurrences. You might be in line with somebody with a situation. You might have been put there for that reason. You might have been put in a situation where you hear a lot of vile language. You might have been put there to correct that. The question is, do we take that sword metaphorically and use it for God?
I mean, the idea Randy brings up is really our interaction with God's providence. We don't know, because we don't have a modern revelation, to know what God has done or happenstance has taken place. All we can assume is that we're here and we need to live godly and stand as a light in the midst of darkness. I think that's what the call is all the way through Scripture. Acknowledge that God does act, acknowledge God will act. And I don't know if He's acting here, but I'm here now, and I need to take this opportunity to live and glorify Him. That's a great point. So we're about out of time, and I'm sorry about that, but we got 5 chapters to cover. They get shorter as we move along. Chapter 8 is kind of is the aftermath after Haman's death. We have the elevation of Mordecai. He is given the signet ring and really takes Haman's position in the kingdom. We have really not the decree reversed, because as Matt brought out, the kings of Persia, when they made a law, it was on the books. They couldn't do anything about it. But what he is allowed to do is make an edict that would allow the Jews to then defend themselves. So in chapter 8, we have the edicts kind of laid out for us. The first decree, made by Haman, happened back in April 13th in 474 BC, and that's back in Esther 3. The second decree, which we have here, was on June the 25th, 474. And then the execution was to be March the 13th of 473. So as you kind of put those together, the Jews had now 8 months to prepare themselves for the enemy's execution of the original edict. And what this addendum really did, what gave them certain abilities, they were allowed to assemble. And it seems like they were allowed to assemble in kind of a military type of way. They could destroy, kill, and annihilate. Notice chapter 8, verse 11. The entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. That's what this addendum allowed the Jews to do. Not only kill the enemies, but to kill families, the family members, and to plunder their spoil. And then we come to the end of chapter 8, and somewhat of a pivotal verse here, I believe, set of verses. It says in verse 15 of the text, "Send him Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness and joy and honor. In each and every province and each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land became Jews, for the dread of the Jews had fallen on them." The end of chapter 8 again emphasizes this change of fortune, this change of position. For the Jews, it was beginning with Mordecai. It was all as it says here, a feast and a holiday, light and gladness and honor. But for the people of the land, what was it? It was dread. And that dread ultimately led some of them to become Jews. But we see here how God reverses fortunes. Chapter 9, and then we'll open up for comments if we have some time left. Chapter 9 is the execution of the decree. And as we look through this chapter, there's three main numbers given. First, in verse 5, there was 500 men killed in the citadel of Susa, the actual fortress, the fortified palace. In verses 15 through 16, there's 75,000 killed in the king's provinces. And then on a second day, 500 are killed in the city of Susa. Now, I think there's some significance in chapter 9 to look at who they killed and what they didn't do. First of all, it seems in the text that they only killed male antagonists. And you say, what's the big deal about that? Well, remember what the addendum said? They could kill the standing army, but any woman or child. They seem to refrain from doing that. The second thing they did not do is they did not lay hands on any plunder. 3 different times in this text, in chapter 9, that is emphasized, that the Jews did not lay hands on any of the plunder. They didn't exercise their rights according to the king's decree. And the question is why is that so? And the list may be myriad, but it seemed to be the idea that people would look upon the Jews and their defense of themselves with a sense of nobility. And the Jews were acting noble. This was not an act of retaliation. This was an act of defense to protect themselves from the aggression of Haman's wicked plot and those who aligned themselves with him. Now, one other thing in chapter 9 is in that group of 500 men in the citadel of Susa, Haman's 10 sons were also killed. And then they were petitioned the king that they would be hanged. So they were killed, and then they were hung or impaled, really, as an object lesson to signify their death. And I want you to understand, we've kind of alluded to this throughout the book of Esther. This is significant. Remember all the way back in 1 Samuel 15, what was Saul supposed to do to the Amalekites?
Utterly destroyed.
It's not here to the book of Esther in chapter 9 that God's will is ultimately done. And there's a couple of object lessons in that. First of all, God's will be done. It may take centuries, it may take time to pass, but God ultimately destroyed the Amalekites for their sins, and it was a descendant, Mordecai, of the son of Kish of the tribe of Benjamin. The last statement in verse 32 of chapter 9 is this: the command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. As a result of their deliverance, a feast was commemorated, and it fell on the 14th and 15th of the month of March, but it also included the 13th. And the 13th was basically a day of fasting. The 14th and 15th were days of celebration. It was the feast they call Purim for the pure, the die that Haman had cast. It was, the book of Esther was read. It was just a time of great celebration. Some people liken it to basically the post-exilic Passover. Just as Passover commemorated their deliverance from the Egyptian bondage, Purim, in some ways, typified their deliverance from the wicked plot of Haman. But I want you to notice something in verse 27 of chapter 9. And the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them. Verse 27 indicates this is a feast that the Jews created to commemorate this event. This was not one of the 3 annual feast days, but something they did on their own to commemorate this occasion. Purim today is probably much, much different than as it was celebrated at this time or even during the intertestamental period. The New York Daily News describes the Feast of Purim this way. He says it's a little bit of Mardi Gras, Easter, Halloween, all rolled into one, a day to let loose and just be Jewish. So they've added all these customs and traditions to what was originally part of a feast. Yes, they read Esther, but they would give gifts of money to those who are poor, send gifts to 2 kinds of food to one person. They would dress up, customary for children, but a lot of adults do as well. They were special pastries they would eat that were often called Haman's ears. And even some places there's mandatory drinking. There's other things associated with it. Not part of what we find in chapter 9. But that's the modern day Feast of Purim. Finally, in chapter 10, who is the main character of chapter 10? Who's chapter 10 talk about? Okay. Yeah. I think chapter 10 is a clue and to help us reinterpret the book. We often call this book the Book of Esther, but in really chapters 9 and 10 to any great degree, the focus is on Mordecai. And then ultimately that tells us we ought to be looking for an unnamed hero. Chapter 10 really points to really 2 characteristics of Mordecai. It says in verse 3, for Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus and great among the Jews and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people and one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. Even back in chapter 9, when we look back in verse 4, Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became great and greater, which I just find striking. The book bears the name Esther. She seems to be somewhat of the focal point, but really the latter chapters all focus on Mordecai and point to his growth and fame and his character. And I just think it's kind of a unique feature of the book. We are out of time. Got one more just quick comment. There's lots of application we can draw from Esther. People have put some forward, but I want us to draw just a quick comparison between Esther and Jesus. And it may just be a similarity. It may not be a shadow. It may not be a type or anything like that. But I think had to be a great deal of comfort for the Jewish people to realize that they had one of their own next to the throne. And in some ways, that's what we ought to feel when we recognize where Jesus is at today. Someone, Charles Spurgeon, said this. He said, "Last of all, let each child of God rejoice that we have a guardian so near the throne. Every Jew in Shushan must have felt hope when he remembered the queen was a Jewess. Today, let us be glad that Jesus is exalted." I think that is one of those, again, whether it's just a similarity, a type, I don't know. But I do think there is something there for us to consider and rejoice in. We got about a minute left. Any comments? We'll conclude there. Victor.
About the plunder and the fact that the Jews, had a little bit from humanity. I think there's a little more to that too, in that one, reliance on God. Don't take their plunder, you can rely on God to provide for you. And then also back to when they were going into the land of Canaan. So that you don't start going with their stuff and inquiring about their gods and things like that, and become curious about the way they worship and things like that. So I think there's a lot of wisdom in that.
Good point. Good point. Everybody hear that? Just the wisdom of not taking of the plunder as it serves as possibly a temptation as well as reliance on God. Anything else? Carl.
Just an interesting show with Mordecai himself, his name meaning little man, and he's raised up second to the throne to serve the seat in Christ, this carpenter who was raised up.
Yeah. Yeah, Mordecai was raised up to be second in the kingdom like two other characters in the Old Testament, right? Daniel and Joseph, right? So we have that parallel as God raises those who are lowly to great heights. Great. Thank you all for your attention. We'll conclude the class there.